from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. So let me introduce him and he will talk about his speech today.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Tozel. All right. So yes, I'm Steve Noel, and I'm definitely we're drilling down on a technical project that we're actually collaborating. We've just recently started a collaboration with a team from UL Lafayette. So Dr. Tozel is the principal investigator for this new collaboration that's actually funded by the MITRE Corporation. And so he's put together a team. Dr. Raju Garumakala is co-PI. So those professors and their students are going to be working on a particular problem, which that's really the idea behind this talk. So how do we advance the slides? Should I just do it here or?
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine. I don't have that many slides, so I think I'll be fine with that. So as I was saying, this is going to be a technical talk, but I want to first give you a little bit more context about the MITRE Corporation, what we're all about, and how MITRE has had certain kinds of impacts in the world of cybersecurity. So I was just trying to give some sort of context for where we're going with this particular project and the technical work that I'm going to be describing. So, okay. No, I think we need to go full screen, probably, right? Is this PowerPoint? Yeah, maybe someone. Yeah, is this a browser, I guess? Yep, there we go. Thank you. There we go. Thank you so much. All right. So a little bit about the MITRE Corporation. The MITRE Corporation is a not-for-profit corporation that operates a number of what are called federally funded research and development centers, or FFRDCs. I'm sure you've heard of Sandia National Laboratory, Los Alamos, Pacific Northwest Laboratory, Lincoln Laboratory, Oak Ridge Laboratory. Each one of those I just mentioned are actually instances of FFRDCs. And so as it turns out, I just did a Google search. If you look at NSF, they have the master list of FFRDCs. I counted 43 currently across the United States, 43 different FFRDCs. And it turns out that MITRE operates 6 of those 43. So, some of these are not as well known as some of the big name facilities, but the point is that these are dedicated R&D centers that work with particular U.S. government sponsoring organizations that are vehicles for doing this research and development on behalf of the U.S. federal government. And again, under these 6 different sort of sectors or sort of problem areas, each one of these have different sponsors that are, promoting that work. So, I work in the area of cybersecurity. I was actually started in security.
Let me put this one on so you can.
Okay, I'll make it a little more convenient. Yep. So when I graduated from UL in 2001, I went and became a research professor at George Mason University. Okay.
It's upon advance backward.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thanks, sir. So working at George Mason University as a research professor, that was my first introduction into the field of cybersecurity. Did a lot of work there under different government funded projects, leading research development for the 13 years up until 2013. I then went to the MITRE Corporation and I was talking about these FFRDCs. One of these FFRDCs actually was started in 2014, this National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. So that was actually the nation's first and only FFRDC that is devoted exclusively to cybersecurity. So again, of those 6 FFRDCs, key one for the work that I've been doing is this NCCOE. And just a little bit about the history of MITRE. I've got this picture. I'm not sure how many of you have seen these sort of, or looked at the history of the internet. It actually started as it was called ARPANET. At the time, what's now DARPA was called ARPA. And so the early beginnings of the internet were started as this ARPANET, which were just early, sort of remote connectivity from different sites across the country. So this is actually a map from the 1970s, and it's showing that MITRE was one of those early members of that ARPANET. And so again, fast forwarded to now, MITRE has a huge presence in the cybersecurity world, again, starting back from working in heavily with computation in general to cybersecurity. As one example, I'm picking out this vulnerability management. So if you're working in computer security, you might have heard of something called Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures, or CVE. So that is a clearinghouse, a sort of a central repository for known vulnerabilities of different software products. So for example, if someone finds out that there's some vulnerability in a particular Microsoft product, say Word, they figure out there's a way to sort of, create a crafty way to break something within that piece of software and then actually compromise your system as a sort of launching point to doing a cyber attack. Then, they would, if they're an ethical sort of white hat person that discovers that, they would then talk to Microsoft, give Microsoft a chance to fix that. And then they would publicly announce through the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures sort of clearinghouse that's managed by MITRE, that this is a known vulnerability for this piece of Microsoft software. So then anyone that subscribes to that registry will know, well, I've got that particular version of that piece of software. So I know now that I'll need to get a patch for that problem. So there are, I want to say, hundreds of thousands at this point, different CVE entries for different known vulnerabilities. So that's just one example of the work that MITRE has been doing. They've actually created this sort of umbrella kind of idea of making security measurable. And so it's really a collection of registries was one example with the Common Vulnerabilities Exposures, like protocols, languages for describing things like how to configure computers securely, how to share cyber threat information, how to describe different kinds of malware. Each one of these things, MITRE has been working on standardization languages, across the whole spectrum. Each one of these sort of areas within making security measurable actually has a number of different, languages or, basically standardization efforts within each one of these categories. So lots and lots of working, across both understanding and even funding from government agencies to, do this kind of work, but also working with, industry to collaborate and to bring together all of this kind of information and standardization. So another example is what's called the MITRE attack framework. This, I forget what this acronym is, but if you go to MITRE or attack.mitre.org, it is essentially, you can think of it as it's a knowledge repository. You can think of it as like a Wikipedia for basically an enumeration of all the different kinds of techniques or attack patterns that adversarial entities will typically do to compromise computers and work their way through a network. So it's actually organized, and I've sort of broken it down. It's a little too big to show all of these columns, but it's a kind of different phases of the attack where you start. Adversary starts by doing reconnaissance, figuring out what's out there that they can attack. Then they have to develop whatever kinds of tools that they need to launch an attack. And then once they get initial access, there's different things that they'll do to do that. And then finally, as you push through to the far right-hand side, where they've actually gotten control of some computer, there's other things like lateral movement, like moving incrementally through the network. But then finally to the sort of, impact of, stealing data, exfiltrating it back to their home base, maybe doing denial of service or whatever it is that they're actually sort of the point of their targeted attacks are. So again, this is a sort of framework and an enumeration, a knowledge base of all the categorized listing of all those different kinds of adversarial techniques. So again, that's attack.miter.org. Okay, that is the backstory. So now I'm going to talk about, the actual project that I'm supporting. And this is the project that we've begun to do, the collaboration with Dr. Tozel's team. And so I'm actually, this is now sort of the backstory, and then we're actually going to focus on the technical work that I'm talking about today, which is this link prediction part. But the sort of overall approach or the stack of capability that we are developing in this project. So you see this acronym ARES, that is Adaptive Resiliency Experimentation System. That is what we call this sort of capability stack. And so what we do, what we're sort of the overall aim of this is, let's say that we're trying to protect an enterprise, let's say some government agency. Then what we do is we put sensors in the environment and try to map out and understand, basically pull in data about the environment, build a model of what the current state of the environment is, and then do simulated attacks and simulated defenses. And we actually look at how to combine different layers of defenses and how those all work together. For example, firewalls or intrusion detection, or maybe it's flushing credentials from some cache server that's people have been logging into, and we found out that that's a gold mine. If someone were to compromise that, they could steal a bunch of passwords. And so the point is that we map out all of that infrastructure, and we then simulate how an adversary could, basically carry out different kinds of campaigns within that environment, and then look at the combinations of the security controls that best position the defender to protect against that. Now, when you put in these security measures, if you, for example, a firewall, if you block a certain access from one computer to another on a certain port, then you might be making things hard for the adversary, but it's going to also hurt the people that are actually trying to get their work done. You could have a side effect of, putting some lack of functionality against your own organizational mission. So that's also part of this sort of optimization problem, is balancing how to best thwart the adversary, but also to keep the mission capability as good as you can. So I'm actually, that part of it, sort of the top of that stack, we actually have some paper about that. So that's not what I'm really talking about today. Today is, and this is actually a very preliminary work that I'll describe. And this is what the UL team will now push the capability much greater, I'm sure. The idea is that one way to capture this environment is to look at historical records of, say, network traffic, login events, to try to map out, okay, this is what's happened in the past. And so under the assumption that that's sort of mission essential and different ways of measuring that, that's sort of your baseline for doing these like simulated attacks and defenses. But we'd also like to say, well, it's likely that in the future, to get our work done, that there'll be network accesses, other kinds of activity on the network that is likely to be needed in the future, but we haven't seen it historically yet. So the idea is to have this predictive model to say, based on what we've seen so far and based on whatever evidence we put together in our models, what are some ways that we can predict future activities in the network? So, for example, there's an area of research called link prediction that typically might have been applied to, say, a social network. So let's say on Facebook, if I'm friends with Bob and friends with Sally, and you're friends with Bob, friends with Sally, there's a strong likelihood that you and I will become friends. So if there's a way to sort of measure that kind of similarity between you and I in terms of our sort of friendships to other folks, that's a way to predict that you and I will become linked together. What we actually hypothesize is that for this kind of network operations, that those semantics really don't hold so much. So in other words, if I've got one laptop and you've got another, and I, go out to this mail server, I go out to this FTP server and this web server a lot, and you go to 2 out of the 3 of those, it's more likely, but there's one web server that I go to that you haven't gone to yet. The hypothesis is that it's more likely you will connect to something else that I've connected to, but not to you, right? There's no point into these 2 laptops connecting together. So we think of that as a kind of traditionally, let's call it a affinity, right? If we're going to link together, it's because, right, birds of a feather kind of flock together. We sort of talk to the same people, so we're likely to talk ourselves. The idea here is like when I reach out to something, it's more about a resource that I need. If I'm a client, I reach out to a server, I need that resource. And so think of it as, let's call it dependency-based linkage. So if we have these sort of commonality in what we reach out to, that's the kind of thing that we're going to predict in terms of future activity. So again, what we're doing is, if we can do a good job of predicting future accesses, the idea is that puts us sort of future proof. So when we actually do these simulated attacks, we figure out the best policy. It's taking into account not only what we've seen in the past, but what's likely to happen in the near term. So there's a paper that we've recently presented at a security conference, and that's actually the technical work. I'm going to be going through that results from that paper. And so the idea is that we first have some kind of way of, if you model this network activity as a graph, then you have some kind of way of assigning similarity between nodes in this graph. So once you have that, you could either, if 2 nodes are sufficiently similar, you could just look at them in a pairwise fashion and say, well, I'll set a threshold. And if we're sufficiently similar, we'll say that, I'll actually show you a picture. We're not going to link ourselves together, but we're going to share sort of common linkages. So you can either do that pairwise, or we also look at like clustering algorithms to find larger groups of nodes that are sufficiently similar to one another. So that's a phase where you just form these groups of nodes that are sufficiently similar. Once you have these, you then have the 2 options: affinity, which is the traditional way of linking, that if we're similar, we're going to link ourselves together, or dependency based. And I'll actually show a picture of those 2. So again, this is sort of a factorial experiment where we just run through all the combinations of those things. And for each one of those combinations of similarity grouping and creating predicting links, you could then do that over some period of time, predict your links, and then look at some future time and actually have different ways of measuring how well your predictions matched up. So it's not only, we do these traditional precision recall F1 score, which is really sort of agnostic to the application. It's not anything particular about security. But we also introduce a couple of other measures that put a security context on those kinds of measures. So I'll explain a little bit about that. And then also, I'd said that there's this idea of applying a threshold. So operationally, you can pick which combination of these algorithms works the best in terms of, let's say, a whole entire range of possible thresholds that get sort of the big picture. But when you need to actually deploy this algorithm, you need to actually, tune and actually decide exactly which level of sensitivity you want to set. So we do sort of some a little bit new kind of way of doing that. That's typically something in the literature. People usually sort of stop here and say, okay, this algorithm is the best, but we actually are going to need to deploy this in a real environment. So we had to push it a little bit more. Okay, so just to sort of recap, as far as we know, this is the first time that people have looked at link prediction in the context of building these kind of predictive models that are going to be part of formulating some network, in some way optimized policy. When I say network access policy, this particular piece of the work is focused on, let's call it microsegmentation, where you just say, by default, I'm going to deny all connectivity across the network, and then I'm going to create some list of what's allowed. So you could think of that as just saying, source computer, destination port, and protocol is a simple model for that kind of policy. So you need to come up with, exactly which sources and destinations and protocols and ports are you going to actually allow, and everything else is denied by default. So then again, we'll look at how this sort of dependency-based semantics plays out and how it actually works better than the infinity-based in terms of these experiments that we do. And then, as I said, we'll then tune our algorithm in a certain way, and I'll go through that. And again, it's part of this ARES adaptive resiliency experimentation system, which is actually within MITRE, it's called a strategic moonshot project. It's actually been recognized as, strategically critically important. And so, as you can imagine from the word moonshot, it's sort of the idea that's like, high risk, high reward. You have to put together sort of a big kind of project to go after this big problem. So that's within MITRE, that's the project that we're engaged with. And there's also this reference to this other paper. So there was a journal paper which describes the overall kind of problem about, what does it mean to optimize in terms of balancing security and mission availability. How do we actually build those models? How do you, like do a, like a fitness function? We do a genetic algorithm to actually find, near optimal solutions to that kind of resiliency optimization. And so again, that's this, if you contact, I can tell you exactly which paper that is. But what I'm talking about today is a more recent paper, which is focused on the link prediction part of that sort of input to the overall optimization. So for this experimentation, we are using a data set that is publicly available. It was a observed set of network flow. So they actually, have like routers that are, as traffic is going through the Los Alamos National Laboratory, they actually collected all this data, anonymized it, and this is over a 90-day period, and they have now publicly shared that data set. So that's what we're using in these experiments, at least some portion of that 90 days. Actually, it turns out we use a very small portion for this initial study. And actually, your team has done, is starting to look at it over much longer timescales, looking at things like periodicity, like there's like weekly cycles in the activity in the network. And so again, what I'm describing is very preliminary, just a sort of almost like a hello world, just really testing this idea of dependency-based versus affinity-based. And so it's just a sort of initial baseline for, for subsequent work. So when I had showed the slide with the first block saying different ways of computing similarity between two nodes, this is a breakdown of those similarity functions that we use for this study. These are all have been around for a long time. We're focused on this idea of affinity versus dependency based. So we were just using sort of standard, well-known ways. This is from the link prediction literature, different formulas that have been proposed for link prediction. Some very simple ideas like Jacquard index, just saying, well, if I've got two nodes and I just look at the number of neighbors that they have in common, and then just normalize that by the total number of neighbors that each of them have. Or this simple idea, preferential attachment, it's saying, sort of like saying, if I'm really chatty and popular, if you're really chatty and popular, then we'll probably ourselves become linked together. Again, these are traditionally using, once you say that two nodes are similar, you would then traditionally say that those two nodes themselves are predicted to link together. We're taking these same measures and saying, so I think it's this slide, where you can actually see a little bit more what I've been hand waving about what I mean by affinity versus dependency. So in this little example, these nodes A and B, you can see that A and B are, A is communicating with 3 of those nodes, B is communicating with 4 of them. So, but A has not communicated with F. But the point is that if you were to compute the Jacquard similarity, you'd say there's 3 out of 4 possibilities where we've both communicated the same way. And if we'd set a threshold to be within that 75%, then you would predict through this affinity sort of semantics. We've been chatting with other folks similarly, so I think we'll ourselves chat. We'll become linked. Or in our case, that there'll actually be like a network traffic that needs to happen from A to B. This new idea, it's a very simple idea, but it's just how it made more sense to us in terms of the semantics of computer networks, is that this is getting cut off just a little bit, but when these A and B are sufficiently similar, but rather than predicting that A and B will actually connect in the future, we actually sort of fill in the blank and say, well, if there's any thing, if A and B are, if I'm similar to B, if B has done anything that I haven't done yet, I'm A. Or if I'm B and A has done something I haven't done yet, then I'm going to go ahead and predict any of those sort of things that you've done that I haven't done, and vice versa. So in this case, we would predict that A will talk to F. So again, we just sort of did that factorial experiment where we took observed data from the Los Alamos lab. We ran through these different combinations of measuring similarity, grouping nodes together, forming a particular group, and then doing either affinity-based or dependency-based, let's say link induction or link prediction. And let's just run let's just let it run and see how it plays out. All right, so this is actually, it's not actually a totally full factorial. If you read the paper, we sort of weed out a little bit of the combinations, but it's most of the combinations of that factorial sort of product of all those different combinations. So in other words, for a given, in this case, let's say Jacquard, and Aries is what I'm calling dependency-based, standard is affinity-based. And so in this case, we have each of the ways, Jacquard, Adamic ADAR, resource allocation. Each one of those are different ways of computing similarity for each pair of nodes. So that's the pairwise way of grouping with whichever similarity we use. And then for the clustering, actually one of the clustering algorithms is really parameter free. It doesn't have a sort of tuning of sensitivity parameter. So we just computed that sort of standalone, but this one hierarchical clustering does have such a parameter. So actually what this chart is saying for each one of these, for one of these combinations, if you remember, I said you would set a threshold to say that if I'm within that level of similarity, then I'm going to group together and I'm going to do some link prediction. So this is just running through the combination, sort of sampling the different threshold values. And so for a given, let's say this curve is probably going to be, I think it's Adamic Adar Aries is this curve. And so this is showing the F1 score. So if you're familiar with F1 score, that's the harmonic mean of precision and recall. So it's sort of an equal mixture. So you have to do well in both precision and recall. So again, we, for this given level of threshold, we do our predictions. We then look at some, tests or some subsequent data to see how well our predictions match, and in terms of how well we've able to have good precision, good recall, and rolled up into F1 score. That's what each of these numbers are. So we do a sort of a typical way of sort of rolling these curves up. And we actually say, well, okay, it's good to have a high value. So I want to have a high F1 score. But like this one is like really good for just a tiny little piece. And this one's, really good over a wide range. So the idea is that you take the area under each of these curves as an overall sort of measure for how well a particular combination, algorithmic combination, actually is. So that's what we're going to say. The area under a particular curve is going to be our sort of measure of goodness for how well each of these sort of predictive combinations is. So these are actually those areas under those curves. And so again, the F1 score again is a composite of recall and precision. So if you just, typically people will say, well, I'm just going to sort of weight them equally. And the F1 score in this case is, that 50% each of precision and recall. So we've got two pairs for each one of these. It's a little hard to read, but the left side, the blue, is the Aries or dependency-based link prediction. And the right side, or the gold, is the traditional affinity-based. And so again, for a given way of measuring similarity and let's say pairwise, at least in the case of some of these other two are the two larger clusters, but the rest are pairwise. And really almost every case. So remember our original hypothesis was that this dependency-based sort of semantics made more sense intuitively to us. And so it turned out that it was validated experimentally, is that if you sort of look across the board. So in this case, it does turn out if you were actually going to deploy a particular algorithm, then this Adamic Adar way of measuring similarity with the dependency-based link prediction, that's the way they were saying, okay, this is our winner. We're going to go ahead and deploy this combination as a way to do future predictions of new links in the network. And again, these are just breaking it down into precision and recall. Actually, on the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about how, and actually these numbers are actually dominated by precision. If you look in the fine print, these numbers are actually small, quite a bit smaller. Precision or values are a lot smaller than the recall. And so that means that drives the F1 score to really be dominated by the how well you're doing in terms of precision. But I'm actually going to, on the next slide, I'm going to talk about how, this hierarchical clustering, and actually did about the same with either of those, either dependency-based or affinity-based. This sort of actually what's going on here is that we're actually sort of we're really allowing too much. We're getting lots of good hits. We're predicting, sort of opened up our net really wide. And so a lot of what we said is probably going to happen actually did happen. But a lot of what we said would happen didn't happen, right? Precision was really low. So again, if you weight these equally, then really this thing really gets sort of pushed off to the side. But I'm going to actually use these two examples in which this is really good. And recall, this is the best in precision. And I'm going to put sort of a security context, because remember, these predictions are actually going to play out in terms of which things we're going to allow within the network. And so that's going to have some ramifications for the adversary, but also potentially some impact on our own sort of mission functionality. So that's actually what's going on here. So if you normally, you have this kind of classification problem, you got, I think it's called a confusion matrix, where there's 4 combinations of whether you predicted something or not, and whether it actually happened or not. So if you're to, work through those 4 combinations, so let's say the true positive, right, is that there's a link that I said it was going to happen, and it did happen. And so the fact that it did happen means that it was needed by the mission. Someone actually needed to do that. But on the other hand, since you predicted that it would happen, you're going to now allow it in your policy, then it could potentially help the adversary. This is what this means, what we call an attack vector. It's a way that an adversary could potentially use that to move through the network. What we actually do in these sort of security context measures is actually look at each one of those links, and we actually have ways of saying which links are known to be vulnerable and which are not. And so these scores are actually taking that information into account. So it's putting more specificity on saying, okay, this particular edge that you're going to allow, this is how important it is to our mission, and this is how much it's important to the adversary. So yeah, actually, I'm not going to sort of belabor that point, but within this paper, if you want to look at those details, we actually define these, what we call a threat containment and mission access measures. And then we typically roll that up into an overall sort of compromise between, trying to make things more difficult for the adversary, but better for our own mission. Okay, so remember, so far what we've done is we've said, okay, we have a way to enumerate these different combinations of algorithmic ingredients that are each one of those is gonna produce some set of predicted edges. And we have a way to measure each of those combinations. And we're gonna pick some, best sort of algorithmic combination, but that was based on looking at the entire range of possible sort of sensitivity tunings across the full spectrum. But when you actually need to put that algorithm out into your environment, you still need to actually pick what's the reasonable setting for sensitivity. So simple-minded idea is to say, well, if this is what the curve looks like, in other words, as a function of the threshold, the sensitivity threshold, I get different values of goodness, which are F1 score. Then a simple way is saying, well, let's take the argmax, right? I'll just find what's the highest value of this curve, and whatever that threshold level is, we'll go with that. But if you remember those kind of crazy erratic curves for this curve A, that simple argmax would have worked in practice. But a lot of these curves, and here's B, it's actually going to be C. This is an example where that really wouldn't work. So it turns out that the argmax, this laser pointer works. It's the solid line right at the edge of the precipice. So if you would just use this naive argmax, then you would set the threshold right there. And these curves are actually sort of over time sort of dynamically moving. if you think about it, there's no reason that these is a dynamic environment. So these curves are probably not going to, like in the future, the curve might look a little different than what it did just when you looked at it from like the past, let's say last 24 hours. So the idea is that it's quite possible that if this curve were to shift just a little bit, that you'd actually, your performance would be really bad. So you want to be careful and sort of set it a little bit more carefully. If you sort of think of this like a noisy signal, right? You've got this sort of wildly erratic signal. You know, what's the best way of sort of characterizing sort of a safe spot? So one idea is to take it's the center of gravity, right? If you're familiar with the center of gravity, if you have some curve and you think of each one of this value as like the weight, you know, how heavy, like you have a stick, you go along this curve and how heavy the stick is at each point. There's some place where if you put your finger there, the stick is going to balance just perfectly. So that's one idea, is just sort of get in the middle of the mass of all this goings on. So that's what this left side is. So that's like sort of two bounds, center of gravity and argmax. And you could also, we have some way of sort of adaptively sort of fitting within those two bounds. But an even better idea, it turns out to be not just taking the raw curve, but treating it as a noisy signal and doing in signal processing a low pass filter. And so we try to smooth out those fluctuations and get the sort of overall trend of that curve. So if you actually just take like a low pass filter, which is what these lower curves are, is a low pass filtered version of the originals, then really either of those is much safer. Like in this case, even just the argmax would have been what I would call a safe zone. And this one was easy anyway. It's sort of anywhere is not bad for this one, but for the danger zone here, you've gotten sort of pretty far away from that precipice. So anyway, that's just some mathematical trickery to try to get through that part of the problem. Again, people typically don't look at this aspect of the link prediction. Okay, and then one final experiment where we said, okay, you know, when we did the first round of experiments, we looked at the network for a period of time, and we took, let's say 75% of that time we used for training, which meant, you think how to say this? Yeah, basically tuning the parameters of those models, and then 25% holdout, so that you can then make your predictions based on the first 75%, and then testing your predictions on the last 75%. So again, that was the baseline sort of study that we just went through. These other two results are looking at what happens if you actually change something about those time windows. And so the first one is just saying that if you actually keep the same 75-25 split, but then you just increase the size of that overall observation window, again, keeping the same 75-25 split, then how does having a larger data set, both in terms of larger training and larger testing, how does that actually impact the best performing algorithm? And so you can see that there's this, and this is actually a log scale on here. So you can think of this as stretching out more, but you can see that rapidly, the performance goes down as you look at larger data sets. So that's just that you're better off looking at smaller time scales. This one is a similar idea, but in this case, you keep the size of the, I think it's the training set as a fixed size, and then you're pushing out the size of the testing. So you're sort of looking deeper into the future as, you know, for your testing. So that one was sort of obvious, but this has sort of turned out how I would have expected it to. But I think that was a little bit surprising that even just with a fixed split and just, it didn't help to actually have more training data, because when you had more test data, it still pushed the performance down. So just to sort of recap all of this. This is actually work that our MITRE team did. And this was before we engaged with the UL Lafayette team. And I had actually, so my dissertation advisor was Dr. Vijay Raghavan. And so, after I had graduated and I was one day asking Dr. Raghavan, sort of what he was working on, he'd mentioned about link prediction. This was back in, mid 2000s, whatever. And so when I then was looking at this problem as part of this Ares moonshot project and looking at this problem of, how to predict the future activity within a graph, a network, I remembered that Vijay had talked about doing some work in link prediction. So that started a conversation circling back with Vijay and characterizing what problem we were after and reaching out to Lafayette to see, if there's researchers here that can really take on this challenge and make it a really solid way of predicting this kind of future network activity. So that's the scope, that's the goal for this collaboration. That's again funded by MITRE to the university, with the professors leading this team, to conduct this work. And so today I was just talking about just some very preliminary results for doing, that sort of exhaustive kind of playing out this one idea, which is the affinity versus dependency based semantics for predicting those links. And then that did turn out to actually outperform it by a lot of orders of magnitude better than traditional affinity-based link prediction. And then we looked a little bit about how you can put a security context on those sort of domain agnostic kinds of F1 score precision recall measures. And then we looked at how you can, when you actually have to operationalize this, some way of tuning the sensitivity of those algorithms. And yeah, looking forward to the future. So I think we're at a good time to let it open up for questions.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Yes, sir.
So if you have any questions, please go ahead and ask. So our guest is here. Steve.
Yes, sir.
Anyway, welcome back.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bayoumi. Yes.
When you were a student, did you like to come to 595 seminar?
There were a couple that I liked. My favorite was the guy that he started a business finding golf balls in ponds when the golfers hit their golf balls into the water. Yeah, that was his business model. That was the early days of that was a new kind of phenomenon of I want to say it was after the .com bust, right? But still people were sort of eager to create new kinds of business models where, right, you could sort of build your own path forward.
His business is still one of the biggest e-commerce in the Gulf. And he's still in Lafayette.
That's a great story. That's a great story. So I enjoyed that talk. Yes, sir. No, I would say yes. Yeah, it was a great opportunity. It was a great idea, and I'm glad that it's continued and tradition. So I would definitely recommend it. Yes.
At a very high level, yeah. So the more prediction you do, the better resilience you have system. And the question, after you predict, what do you do?
Right. So not necessarily. So I could make a predictor which says I'm going to predict everything will happen. Okay, I'll say it's going to all happen, and I'll have perfect recall, right? Because something will happen, and I predicted it, right? I said it would happen, and something happened, and I've got that covered. But my precision is terrible because I said everything would happen, but really only a few things happened. So it's a trade-off, right, between balancing, right? So you can't. There's that trade-off, and that's just in terms of the first part of your question, which is. how do you score the predictions and what does it mean to be good in doing your predictions?
If my prediction is good.
Yep.
This means my resilience system will be good.
I'm gonna get to that. So let's say that we don't do any link prediction, right? Which was actually the big, that was how our first 1.0 version was. And so that meant, so one idea is that, okay, we've observed what has actually happened. We're going to assume that that's actually all benign and, it could be the adversary was actually there, but we're going to just treat that as, well, he was doing his job too. So we're going to sort of freeze that and say that's a baseline. And then we do the other top of that stack is then doing the simulated attacks and defenses. So from that baseline, we're then going to do a sort of optimization of what things we're going to allow and not allow. And we have a way to measure that in terms of the impact to the adversary, in terms of our models for these multi-step attacks and everything we know about threat models and all that. But also everything that we do will have some potential impact. We have a way to measure our mission and sort of how different links are actually like access from one computer to another. So there's that part of it that we are studying how to measure that. So again, the scope of that journal paper was sort of an initial model for that. Like, how do you actually characterize that trade-off between those competing sorts of things? So, all right, so I said that if we had done no prediction, then that meant that you could say, well, okay, this is what we've seen in the past. We're now gonna look at the last 24 hours. We do our sort of gameplay, and then we say, okay, this is what we're going to push onto the network as enforcing the policy for the next 24 hours. So now if it turns out that now some new stuff that people, like a new employee comes in and or maybe that's a bad example, but someone needs to access a mail server that they didn't access over the last 24 hours, but they do today. If we didn't predict that, that means that they'll have the access blocked. So one way of treating that is to say, well, that means you're going to get a phone call. Your security center is going to have to do whatever. You've got some sort of manual process. That's one way of arguing, is to say that we'll sort of muddle our way through. In other words, you're going to log the stuff that's denied, so you can then treat those things as a separate process. What we're trying to do with the link prediction is be a little more proactive and say, okay, we think we can do some prediction about what will need to happen. So if we do a good job at that, and then if what we say needs to happen over the next 24 hours actually is needed, so that means that we don't block our stuff for the benign, for our folks. But again, that becomes input, the stuff that we're going to predict, that we're going to say, okay, we think this is going to happen. We're going to roll this out. We're going to let this allowed in the network. But, we better play our cyber, red team, blue team, to see what's the trade-off between, is that going to introduce some unnecessary, some risk that we can't tolerate versus something that that's mission critical. So it's really about doing a better job of understanding what we think will be needed by our actual mission stuff. Yeah, so hopefully that covered it.
Can you hear me? Steve, can you hear me?
Hi, yes, hi VJ. Hi VJ.
Hi. No, it was a follow-up type of question to what you were just explaining. If if a prediction is made that somebody should get this new access, how do we distinguish between whether if it's not consistent with the policy, that policies should be changed, versus saying that, well, the prediction just wasn't right, the prediction model probably should be changed.
Right. Yeah, okay, thanks, Vijay. So let me sort of try to echo your question. And I think there's some sort of underlying assumption there. So I think you're saying that if you make some prediction, is there some notion of ground truth or some sort of gold standard, that you could say, well, okay, this is predicted and it's really what we know to be the kind of thing that makes sense to us according to some ground truth or some other a priori information versus, like this is something that we just shouldn't have, it's a prediction, but it's like wildly, it just doesn't make any sense. So that sort of, let's sort of back this up a little bit. So traditionally it would be, before you had all this automation and there's, whatever stuff that we're trying to do in this project, you would have a security team that would have to manually understand what their users need. And it's tough for them to, come up with what's the best kind of, let's say, firewall policy that they should be deploying. And so the way they typically do it is they can't do it with super precision because it's just not manageable. They can't really get to that. There's only so much granularity that they can manage in a manual way. So they'll do things like create a group of like a subnet, a CIDR block, a group of IP addresses and say, well, if any machine happens to get into that IP address range, we're just going to treat it all the same. And again, that takes into, the domain knowledge of the network administrator, but also they're going to have to do some kind of balance between what's the level of granularity that they put into their firewall policies. So this concept of what I sort of glossed over or maybe didn't mention at all, there's this idea of micro segmentation is a sort of newer idea where if you could use some sort of automation, if you could actually create these very fine-grained, like in our case, we're actually going down to the individual IP source destination protocol and port level. And so that's too much for a security team to handle manually. So the idea is that can we build, do some automation, build some models, build whatever, that's sort of the direction we're going. So now the question is, I don't know, maybe there probably is somewhere between those two extremes, right? There probably is some domain knowledge and something that could go into this formulation of what we're doing. So yeah, that's I think a big part of and so, right now sort of state of the art is, there are like tools that do this kind of like security enforcement. Let's say we actually do all of our experimentation for Amazon Web Services, like a cloud architecture. And there's like an Amazon Web Services, policy, group policy enforcer that's, sits on every virtual machine and enforces like a local firewall just for each virtual machine in this cloud instance. And so, they say, okay, well, here's your input. Give me a list. What do you want to allow? I don't know, right? It's now up to you to define what's the policy. So that's kind of the space we're in, and it's a changing sort of landscape. So yeah, it's a lot of room for innovation to try to help that stuff. I hope that covered it. What you were asking, Vijay.
Yes, yeah, we can follow up later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Oh, Dr. Singh, yes.
I was thinking of student probably should ask some questions. Okay, in particular, like those who attend my computer architecture course, you should have a lot of questions to ask.
Oh my God.
Yeah, there's going to be a test later. There will be a test later.
Yeah, I don't know about the accuracy and the policy that you elaborated that Dr. Baiman asked, and of course, I think Dr. Raghavan look at it from different angle. But what I'm interested in is prediction accuracy.
Right.
Okay, architecture has been doing this since for decades. And then they finally come out with, okay, now one model is not enough. So that's why I'm talking about prediction.
Right.
So they have two models.
Yeah.
Tournament.
Yeah.
Two of them. In this case means that now you say that, oh yeah, okay, now I need to weight this affinity this much and then dependency this much. So that is the problem. But the point is that actually you look at this whatever data set that you observed, and then you assume that there's just one case, which may or may not be the best situation. So the point is that Actually, that's why they told me, branch up, prediction started saying, okay, 2 model is not enough. Let me go to 3 model, 4 model, and so on.
Yep.
And then pick the best one at that moment based on something.
Sure.
So that's what I try to say, that I have time to
Sure.
talk about this.
No, I want to make sure I understand your question. You're talking about sort of as the network is dynamically evolving.
Yes,
So that is certainly one of the aspects. In fact, that's one of the things that Raju was pointing out is actually capturing a time dependent version of this model.
yes, actually, it shouldn't be too hard because I think you have a basis there. It's just that I don't want to just.
Absolutely.
Yeah, look at it just. one.
No doubt. This is definitely a toy. This was a toy sort of experiment. And it's another question someone could ask, well, state of the art is like, it's not those things from like 2004, right? It's like a deep neural network that's trained with a genetic algorithm, blah, blah, blah. But the point was, we were just trying to understand that sort of basic question about the affinity kinds of semantics. But yeah, I mean, the point is your team is really going to dive into this, and it's going to be a multi-year effort.
I'm sure that-
And so, yeah, we're still formulating actually what is exactly the right problems to go after. And yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Raju?
I mean, I wouldn't ask if they have. any questions.
Yes, thank you. I know they're looking at the clock too.
See, context is very important when you're talking about network access policy. the
Right.
patterns, isn't it?
Yes,
I mean, there is context with time. and
Yes.
Context with the environment itself.
absolutely. The behavior, right?
behavior.
One example, so there's this idea called zero trust. This is a sort of a newer idea. And so there you're initially allowed something, but then you're being watched. And if you start acting wonky, you could have your access revoked right then and
Right.
there. So again, this is a very simple network access policy model. It is actually enforced currently by the Amazon Web Services group policy, but that's actually we actually are starting to look at, let's say, the application layer, looking at microservices and looking at enforcement, more of what you're talking about, more sort of dynamic revocation, for example, of something that's allowed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious.
So if you have some ideas in that, that's definitely a way that that's the way we want to move. That's the way we want to move forward. So yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Be able to capture context sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I just described was really the contribution is more about posing the problem than actually, coming up with a great solution, right? So I've teed it up for you guys, so you can knock it out of the park now. But
Any other questions? Okay, then, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you, Steve.
thank you very much. Thank you very much. All right.